محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين، شفيع المذنبين وحبيب قلوب الصادقين، سيدنا ومولانا أبي القاسم محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم إلى قيام يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. أما بعد. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Good morning to all of you. In this conference, and inshallah, in the coming sessions, we are going to be talking about a return to tradition. And in order for us to better understand what that means and how it is possible for us to have that return effectively be a part of our lives, our decision-making, our thinking, we have to examine the different components of our tradition and the foundation of our faith and our values. I would like to begin by telling, I'm going to call it a story, although it is actually a joke, but that sounds a little bit too lighthearted. It's said that there is a person who told his friend, I have the original sword of Imam Ali, the original Zulfaqar. And his friend didn't believe him. He said, like, you have a really good replica? No, it's the original sword. The very sword that Imam Ali held in his hand, that he used in all of those great battles. And still, his friend was a little dubious. And he said that, no, it is the same sword. Granted, I've had to replace the blade about 5 times. And the handle has been replaced 7 times, but it is the very same sword. And you're free to laugh at any point if you would like to. The question that comes, at what point does it cease to be the same sword if you've replaced both the blade and the handle, when that is exactly what makes up a sword? Most of us would say that it's not the same anymore. But then there is a follow-up question, which I think is a little bit more insightful. Let's say that we have 2 depictions or replicas of Dhul Faqar. One of them is going to be as historically accurate as possible. You know, these people who do a lot of research on details, exactly what alloy must have been used. So they'll scour museums and articles and they'll find out, what forms of iron were present and what the processes of smelting and the processes of forging a sword were and how it was likely to have been created. And maybe they have other documentary or archaeological evidence and what kind of wood would have been used and how it would have been processed. And so we have the most historically accurate representation of, if not Dhul Faqar itself, than the sword that would likely have been used by the Prophet and his companions and the early Muslims. And then we have a second replica, which is alive in the hearts of a community. Those of you who are active participants in commemoration of the sacrifice of Karbala, you know what I am referring to, that there are certain symbols that are alive in a community. They may not be historically the most accurate in terms of the colors, in terms of the shape, in terms of the outward form of what is being represented as, for example, the alam or the standard of Karbala, or the other depictions that we may have in our common practice or our art, whether it be visual arts or, as was more important in our Islamic tradition, the arts of poetry and commemoration with mourning. It is not as historically accurate, but it is a living connection, and there is a continuity from the time of the Prophet, from the events of Karbala until today, in that emotional, visceral, living connection. Which of the two replicas is a more accurate depiction of Dhul Faqar? Now, the way I've set it up, we're all going to choose B. It's kind of like that teacher that's asking a question, and the inflection of their voice tells the students which is the right answer. So it's clear what the answer is supposed to be, at least in the way that I told it. But if we're honest with ourselves, most of us would probably gravitate towards the first depiction and say, okay, this is the accurate. And many of us may actually view with disdain or condescension or a little bit of an effort that, all right, we need to fix this. This is not historically accurate. I heard the speech, but I read a maqtal, and the speaker only mentioned the text, but I read the footnotes. And so we're going to move the events of the story around to try to get the most historically accurate version, without realizing that even your most historically accurate version, with all the footnotes, is still going to have many gaps. It's not like you have video, there was no GoPro camera at the events of Karbala. So, yes, you should look for historical accuracy. That's not to say that's not important. But the more important part is that connection to the story, to the values, to the purpose of that sacrifice. So, if the second depiction is going to be entirely inaccurate, then to the extent possible, with humility and in a graduated manner, we want to take our symbols and we want to restore them to be as close as possible. But the important point is it is the living aspect of that symbol that is the key. Our connection to the events, to the sacrifices, even the outward symbol is not to have the most accurate outward depiction of what our imams might have looked like physically, or what their sword might have looked like, or what their standard might have looked like, or even the chronology or the outward events that took place in their life. But it is to use all of those as accurately as we are possible to get to something that is behind it, and that is more profound, and that is deeper. And it is a tragedy of our culture and our upbringing that we often get so distracted in that outward aspect that we forget that that can be a distraction. And that greater accuracy, we think that we are learning something, we are more educated. Many of us think that we know better than our parents because we have more data, and they'll say something anachronistic. And the reality is that those same people that we may look down upon have actually sacrificed more and have a greater visceral connection and may have proven it in the choices they have made and in the sacrifices they have made in their life than I, who think that I know more because I have a degree or I have more outward knowledge. The point is that the reality of our value system is rooted in a connection to that which goes beyond the outward surface, towards the essence and towards the heart. And that is how we can understand the reality of our ummah. And what is the foundation, not just of the ability of the ummah to fulfill its purpose, but of its very existence. There is a narration, many of you may have heard it, and so I will say it very briefly, that is reported from our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam,
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
That in a lengthy narration, he, along with his father, Imam Muhammad al-Baqir alayhi salam, was summoned by the Caliph at that time, Hisham ibn Abdul Malik, to Syria. And when they arrived in Damascus, there was a conversation that took place in which the knowledge and also the miraculous greatness of our fifth Imam was established. And then when they were leaving Damascus, the narration says that there was a very aged, well-known Christian alim is the term used in the hadith, a knowledgeable person who used to worship Allah for the entire year, but would come out once in a year for one day to bless and greet and to maybe answer some questions from the Christian community of Syria. They're his devotees. And so when they were leaving Damascus, it happened to be that day according to the narration. And so Imam Baqir, he shielded his face with a portion of his cloak, and Imam Ja'far Sadiq, who was young, did the same thing. And it was a multitude that was gathered, and that elderly Christian scholarly figure or ascetic, he looked over the crowd and the multitudes, and due to his worship, he was able to pick out those that were worthy of his attention. And so, according to the narrations, his eyes settled on the fifth Imam. And he said, Aminna am min al-ummatil marhuma. Tell me, are you from amongst us, meaning the Christian community, or al-ummatul marhuma? Are you from this ummah which has been shown mercy, which is blessed? And we can talk about the authenticity of the narration, but we do have other evidence that this term was familiar and was used. And there is also a narration in Sunan Abi Dawood, according to which our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
is reported to have said, Ummati hadhihi ummatun marhuma. That this nation of mine, or this community of mine, and maybe the best thing is just to use the word ummah in English, as we will see, this ummah of mine is a blessed ummah. So we have a conception of this ummah as having been blessed. The narration in Sunan Abi Dawood implies that the blessing is because this ummah will not be punished in the hereafter. لَيْسَ عَلَيْهَا عَذَابٌ فِي الْآخِرَةِ وَعَذَابُهَا فِي الدُّنْيَا الْفِتَنُ وَالزَّلَازِلُ وَالْقَتْلِ. If there is any kind of adhab or any kind of torment that this ummah will suffer, it is in this world. as we can see in our history and in the present day. But if it is true that even non-Muslims were familiar with this word and would view the Muslim Ummah as blessed, then it's important for us to examine what is it about the Ummah that makes it unique. And here we can turn to the Quran. The Quran gives us a message of the greatness of this Ummah, but it's not an easy message for us to understand. For example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ وَيَكُونَ الرَّسُولُ عَلَيْكُمْ شَهِيدًا. We have made you a wasat community, a middle community. لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ, that you may be witnesses for people. وَيَكُونَ الرَّسُولُ عَلَيْكُمْ شَهِيدًا. And so that the Prophet may be a witness over you. Now, the first question that we get is, what is this wasat? Someone might say that, well, it's geographical. The trade routes between China and Rome throughout Eurasia, they pass through the heartland of the Muslim world, this Ummah. Everybody in the world now knows that this Ummah controls Babul Mandab. People who didn't even know what that was maybe a month ago. And that's to say nothing of the Straits of Hormuz and Gibraltar. Inshallah, we will find that that control is a source for the alleviation of suffering and the avoidance of harm to all innocent people in humanity. That is not just a far-fetched interpretation, by the way. That geographical or that geostrategic view of the centrality of this ummah, because the previous verse says, سَيَقُولُ السُّفَهَاءُ مِنَ النَّاسِ مَا وَلَّاهُمْ عَنْ قِبْلَتِهِمُ الَّتِي كَانُوا عَلَيْهَا قُلْ لِلَّهِ الْمَشْرِقُ وَالْمَغْرِبُ. So the previous verse does say that it is the foolish people who will say, what changed this ummah from the qibla that they used to face, which was Baytul Maqdis, Jerusalem, and is causing them to face a different qibla. قُلْ لِلَّهِ الْمَشْرِقُ وَالْمَغْرِبُ. Say, to Allah belongs the east and the west. So the context of this verse is explicitly talking about the geographical position of this ummah and the direction of this ummah. It's not far-fetched. But of course, that's not the full meaning or the deeper meaning of this verse. What Mufassirin have mentioned, Allama Tabatabai quotes in Tafsir al-Mizan, is there is a more intricate meaning for this middleness, this wasat in the verse, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. There are two extremes within humanity. There are some people, when they think of spirituality, when they think of the sacred, then they ignore this world. And so their brand of worship or devotion or spirituality is about renouncing this world, looking down upon the pursuit of worldly knowledge, worldly power, worldly wealth, and even marriage and families and all of those things that pertain to this world. And then there are other forms, not just of political or economic thinking, but even religious ideologies that are very materialistic and focused entirely on the acquisition of material resources. You have the prosperity gospel, which is widespread in this country. I won't name other names, but there are some religions that say that, we don't focus so much on the hereafter. We are about making this world a better place, and we have a very worldly type of teaching. And as Allama Tabatabai explains, if you go the first route, then you are very focused on the goal, because that is the goal, but then you're undermining yourself by ignoring what is the means to attain that goal. And so, yes, you want to be an ascetic, and you want to be pious, and you want to be a devotee, but all of those things that are going to allow that to take place are being undermined. And this might not make sense yet, but the next step will make it a little bit more clear, because you cannot be a devotee as an individual. And the second route, if you take that route, you are undermining yourself because you're getting all of the tools and then you don't have a goal to use those tools for. If I could get $1 billion by selling out my friends and my family and all of those relationships and all of those things that are meaningful, then it's absolutely worthless. Because the only value of having that resource or that wealth would be to use it to strengthen and to better those relationships. I'm not talking about what those relationships are or should be, but just on a conceptual level, whatever they might be for an individual. So there is an extreme that we find within the cultures, within the politics, within the economic systems, and even within the religions of the world, that either they go too far in focusing on spirituality and devotion, which is important, but it needs a means, or they go too far in focusing on the material betterment of one's circumstances. These days, the whole world is talking about China and how it has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And there is a very real question about what next. What is that prosperity for? I'm not speaking about any particular nation or economic system, but a question for humanity. And so, according to this tafsir, that middleness is that this ummah is to restore the equilibrium. That you need to be focused on prosperity for a reason. Power for a principle. Wealth for a value system. But you need that means. And you cannot divorce one from the other. And so this is a middle ground between those two extremes that destroy the equilibrium of the human body and the human soul, which were created by Allah to be complementary. That geostrategic centrality of this ummah may be just one way that Allah facilitated that role. But then, as Allama Tabatabai says in Tafsir al-Mizan, the Quran says that there is a result. لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ وَيَكُونَ الرَّسُولُ عَلَيْكُمْ شَهِيدًا. The reason why you have been given this position, this middleness, this centrality, is so that you can be a witness for humanity, and the Prophet can be a witness over you. And this witness that we are called upon to have is not a superficial witness, but it pertains, as Mufassirin have said, to the Day of Judgment. On the Day of Judgment, is Allah going to look for witnesses to say, all right, what did so-and-so do? Your hands and your feet, your eyes and your ears, and the land that you are on will testify to what you did. So this testimony is not to the outward aspect of what did the person do, but it is a testimony to what was in the person's soul. Because that is the basis of reward and punishment. There may be many of us who have prayed, but Allah will say that your prayers were to impress and not to serve. Especially people in my position, if I want to seek this world, the best way for me to do it is to have a tasbih in the hand and to present myself as being very pious. You might think that I am pious. I might even fool myself into thinking that I am very pious. But Allah knows. And that is the testimony that is being referred to in this verse, that is going to serve in that divine court of the hereafter, not to say, did he miss a prayer and did he pray Fajr on time? But when he prayed Fajr on time with that fancy adhan and that beautiful recitation, was it for Allah or was it for his own worldly desires? And the same thing, there might be people who have committed sins, but Allah knows what was in their heart and what excuse they have and whether they are worthy of forgiveness and mercy and intercession. And so this brings us now from the Ummah to the Imam. If it were just that we are a middle nation, then to say, Hasbuna kitabullah, Ya Rasulullah, we'll take it from here. You go back to your Lord, enjoy your reward in heaven after all of your sacrifice. It was 23 years that you gave us. We have the sword and we have the book, and we can conquer the territories. We can establish the trade routes. We will take place of these chokeholds for maritime trade and terrestrial trade. And if it were just to give a little bit of a balanced message, that would be one thing. The Ummah could do it. Not well, as history tells us, but we could do it on some level. But if it is لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ وَيَكُونَ الرَّسُولُ عَلَيْكُمْ شَهِيدًا, can we do it at all? It's not that we can do it and not do it well. We cannot do it at all. Because the most that anyone of this ummah can see is the surface, not the heart. Therefore, not that which is going to be important in the testimony on the Day of Judgment. So the key question is that clearly Allah is not referring to all of the ummah, but He is addressing the nation. And that is the heart of the question that we need to understand to unlock the meaning of the usage of the word ummah in the Quran. Let us look at another verse. كُنْتُمْ خَيْرَ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ. You are the best ummah that is brought forth among the nations, among the people. تَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَتَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ وَتُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ. You enjoin what is good, you forbid what is evil, and you are faithful in Allah. Now, leaving aside the fact that most of this ummah not only has not enjoined what is good, but it has not done what is good when it counts. And so there is a weakness in our amr bil ma'ruf and our nahi anil munkar and our iman billah. What is this verse referring to? If it is addressing the entire ummah. Because even if we say that many of us have done it, and that is a problematic and debatable assertion, clearly the entire ummah is not worthy of that praise. It's kind of like a mouse and an elephant crossing a bridge in a jungle. And when they get to the other side, the mouse turns to the elephant. We really made that bridge shake, didn't we? Most of us are not the elephant in that example. So, kuntum khayra ummah addresses the entire ummah. وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا addresses the entire ummah. But it gives us a hint in the verse of Surah Al-Baqarah that لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ. This isn't referring to all of you, because what could you testify to? And in the verse of Surah Al Imran, تَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَتَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. Even if I have studied Islam now for several decades, there is only a limited ma'ruf that I could even aspire to command to, because I don't know all of what is ma'ruf. And there is only a limited munkar that I could aspire to prohibit, because my knowledge of what is good and what is bad is finite and it is limited. So in both verses there is a hint. Now let us move towards an understanding of what is the heart of that. Imagine that we have a contest. This is one of my problems with our modern language and culture, that serious things always have to be compared to a game. So we say that there are people, political actors, they are in the game of politics, the game of war. It is demeaning to the sanctity and the importance of politics and of just war for self-defense and for liberation to say, in order to understand it, we have to compare it to a game. The reason why we have to do that in our society is because there is a primacy of entertainment and leisure, and so we really only understand things if they are compared to a game. So imagine there is a game. And we have a team, and in that team, there are some people who know a whole lot about, say, geography, but nothing about physics. And other people who know a lot about physics, but not the first thing about geography. And other people with other things that they know about, perhaps history, perhaps another field of study. And the way that this team is going to be asked questions is that they have to take turns in answering questions. So it might be your turn and you are an expert in physics. And I will ask the question, where is the Strait of Malacca? And you're like, I don't know, Jupiter? And then there is a question about physics. I don't know enough about physics to even come up with a hypothetical question. And you know all about geography. And so you won't answer that question. And maybe you'll get lucky and your expertise will be what the question is. So how will that team do? If you were to evaluate that team, they're all experts, PhDs in their field. It's a very hypothetical thing because people are not that airheaded if they've come to that level of education, but hypothetically. You would say that this team, it might get, 1/5, 1/3 of the questions right. In the aggregate, they know every answer to every question. That's the key. In the aggregate, they know every answer to every question, but what is their outcome going to be? Maybe 1/5, 1/3. Why? Because it's luck of the draw who gets one question. Then we say, all right, we're going to change the rules of the game. You can consult. After you hear the question, you can choose which of the team is going to answer. Same questions, same team. Now what? That same team that you say they're probably going to place 5th is going to place 1st. And I feel like I'm losing you. Let's just come back together with a salawat.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
Same team, same ummah, same challenges or questions in life. But just the way that the organization and the structure and the conception of that team changes makes it be a below average team in one scenario and the very best team in another. Does that make sense? So that is exactly why the Quran refers to the Ummah as the greatest Ummah. Kuntum khayra Ummah. أخرجت للناس وكذلك جعلناكم أمة وسطا. The reason is that the very nature of the ummah is that it has a certain structure. The greatness of the ummah is not determined in the first instance by you and me. It is determined by who is the imam of that ummah. Because the word ummah in Arabic is derived from the verb amma ya ummu, which means to turn in a certain direction, to face a certain direction. So you only become an ummah if you have a shared qibla, if you have a shared path, and if you have a shared focal point of your worldly and your religious focus and efforts. And the definition of that ummah is that focal point. Because if you have 1 million people and you don't have that qibla, you don't have that imam, you don't have an ummah. But if you have that focal point and no one else, then you have an ummah and you will create an ummah. So it's not figurative, but that is what the Quran is reminding us. It is lifting us up by our affiliation to that ummah, but it's also smacking us down ever so gently. And that is the best smackdown, where the person doesn't even realize it unless they think about it. They come back the next day. You know what? That wasn't a compliment. That was actually something that I should have tried to respond to. The Quran is telling us that you are only so good as your affiliation to your imam. And that is why I said we will come back to it. Even those religions that teach asceticism and devotion, they are missing the mark. Because at its heart, our ummah and the role of the ummah, just as it is centered on the imam, is something that requires a collective sense of responsibility. The same Quran that says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا عليكم أنفسكم لا يضركم من ضل إذا اهتديتم. O you who believe, focus on yourselves. It doesn't matter to you. It doesn't harm you, whoever might be misguided, if you are guided. When it teaches us to pray, does not teach us to pray for ourselves, but teaches us to pray, رَبَّنَا لَا تُزِغْ قُلُوبَنَا بَعْدَ إِذْ هَدَيْتَنَا وَهَبْ لَنَا مِن لَدُنْكَ رَحْمَةً. So the Quran says, worry about yourselves. It doesn't matter who is going to be misguided. It's not going to harm you if you are guided. Tells us, قُوا أَنفُسَكُمْ وَأَهْلِيكُمْ نَارًا. When you pray, oh Allah, don't misguide our hearts after you have guided us. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ اهْدِنَا الصِّرَاطَ الْمُسْتَقِيمِ. Guide us to the straight path. It is a collective prayer. And even more interestingly in Surah Al-Furqan, رَبَّنَا هَبْ لَنَا مِنْ أَزْوَاجِنَا وَذُرِّيَّاتِنَا قُرَّةَ أَعْيُنٍ وَاجْعَلْنَا لِلْمُتَّقِينَ إِمَامًا. How many of us care about the health of the marriages, even of our brothers and sisters, let alone other members of our Muslim community? Normally when we pray, even if we do this prayer, although it is explicitly teaching us that, oh Allah, for our ummah, for our community, for my brothers and for my sisters in faith, give us good spouses that are the pleasure of my heart, and give all of us good offspring that bring tranquility to our soul. We're really thinking, Allah, give me a good spouse. That's why single people who are looking to get married, read this dua. You should read that dua. Read it. People with children that they are raising, read this dua. But then if you're married, sometimes we say, all right, I'm done. Unless something goes wrong in the marriage, رَبَّنَا هَبْ لَنَا مِنْ أَزْوَاجِنَا وَذُرِّيَّاتِنَا قُرَّةَ أَعْيُنٍ وَاجْعَلْنَا لِلْمُتَّقِينَ إِمَامًا. But this dua is explicitly, and it's not something that's natural. Because, how much have I thought about your marriage? Hopefully not too much. The dua is reminding us that there is a collective aspect to our spirituality. My marriage is not going to be fulfilled if the marriages of my fellow believers are barren. And my own children cannot be qurrat ayn for me unless they live in a community. Because who is my daughter going to marry? If all of the young men are just playing, Fortnite or some other game all day? And who is my son going to marry if the daughters of our community view motherhood and childbearing as a burden and family as something backwards? So it is collective, even in our self-interest, but in our spiritual view. And then the last part of this verse, and I will conclude with that. وَجَعَلْنَا لِلْمُتَّقِينَ إِمَامًا. I've heard some people say that, the Shia, I don't know what they're thinking about, talking about imamat being so central. This verse tells us that everybody is an imam. I'm an imam. You can be an imam. The Quran tells us, وَجَعَلْنَا لِلْمُتَّقِينَ إِمَامًا. And the answer to that is very simple. رَبَّنَا هَبْ لَنَا مِنْ أَزْوَاجِنَا plural. وَذُرِّيَّاتِنَا plural. قُرَّةَ أَعْيُنٍ. وَجْعَلْنَا لِلْمُتَّقِينَ إِمَامًا singular. Not وَجْعَلْنَا لِلْمُتَّقِينَ أَئِمَّةً. If it had been وَجْعَلْنَا لِلْمُتَّقِينَ أَئِمَّةً, I would say, all right, I'll become Sunni. I wouldn't still, because there's other reasons not to, but at least this one objection would make some sense. The Quran is not saying, pray that Allah makes you an imam. The Quran is saying there is one imam. Pray that you become part of the path of that imam. Because the essence of the ummah, the heart and the soul and the reality and the manifestation and whatever else you can say of this ummah is that connection to the imam. And so let us conclude with a prayer for the imam of our time and for his reappearance. And may Allah allow us to be witnesses and to be present and to offer our assistance in the time of his reappearance. And the way that we do that is by offering him our life and our soul during the time of his absence for the hastening of his reappearance and the fulfillment of his promise. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Allah salli ala